Recently, we had a class featuring Deborah Lipstadt and talking about Holocaust revisionists. In that class, I presented a video of John Houseman delivering a lecture as a law professor at Harvard, and 20th Century Fox appears to have taken exception to my utilization of that clip. That is somewhat annoying, but I'm actually kind of grateful because it allowed me the opportunity to look at the clip and present an alternative point of view for you. So instead of pretending that I'm a law professor at Harvard talking to graduate students, I'm going to ask anyone watching to pretend that I am Carol Quigley talking to graduate history students at Georgetown University. And what I will have to say to you is this. The study of history is to many of you unknown territory. And we use the Socratic method here. I call on you, I ask you a question, and you answer it. On occasion, I will ask a follow-up question. Why do I not deliver a lecture? Because by this technique, I am attempting to inspire in you the ability to think in terms of relations, in terms of understanding personalities and events and historical conditions, so that you see the connections between the invention of a device and the application of that device in an event in history. I intend to inspire in you the ability to observe and appreciate relationships, to observe the connections between various personalities, various events, and various forces in history. You come into this class with a hodgepodge of facts, and I hope to deliver you leaving thinking like statesmen. You will recall that Carol Quigley said that he could not teach a person to think critically if they had only learned to acquire facts. His goal is to teach people to think critically with those facts. That is, if they have the facts, he is in a position to teach them how to use the facts. But if they've only learned the facts and don't have the ability to, he wants them to use the multitude of facts that they have acquired in understanding their human culture and the interactions between people. They come into his class without an understanding of the interrelationships of the law with that vast collection of interrelationships between people. And Dr. Houseman's questions are intended to teach them to see the relationships between what the law says and the relationship between friends, wives and husbands, a contractor and a client, and to come to appreciate the complexity and the logic of those relationships as it is applied in language. Now, to back that up a little bit, to talk about logic. Logic is a tool of language for discerning what is true. It has always been, at least since the Greeks in the 5th century BC, it's been a tool for learning what is true in contradistinction to what is false. It's always been open to new information. It has sometimes been guilty of forcing that new information into categories into which that new information shouldn't have been fit. but it's always been open to new information. For example, there is a philosophy whereby angels are considered to be real. Now, what do I mean by the word real? I mean that they are capable of interacting with human beings in history. They are capable of doing certain kinds of things in space and time. That's one understanding of real. But does that understanding of real mean that they are limited by the laws that limit matter? Because I am made up of matter, my hand can't go through this table. It's a law of physics that two objects can't occupy the same space at the same time. Because angels are a different type of being, they aren't limited by the things that limit entities that are made up of matter. If you understand that dimension or that aspect of the language that talks about angels, then the question as to whether how many angels can dance on the head of a pin is a perfectly logical question. You may not think it's an irrelevant question, that's a different matter. But in terms of the logic of language, it makes perfectly good sense. Dr. Hausman wants his graduate lawyers to know enough about the law and enough about human relationships to know how they react and interface with one another. Now, every logician is interested in your learning how to apply the laws of language and logic so that you can discern what is true and what is false. Dr. Hausman, in his role as an instructor, wants his lawyer graduates to know how to apply the law to benefit their client. If we lived in an ideal world, that lawyer would be seeking the truth and have the truth serve his client. But we don't live in that kind of best world. We live in the world in which we live. Now, to come back to the presentation that I was trying to start, and now I know I'm going to have to do the speaking for each part. Maybe we can get this to work and maybe we cannot. But I'm going to continue trying. Hope springs eternal.
Let me ask you, why are you trying to play this when I think we all understand what you're trying to do. You can do what you're trying to do without playing this thing.
Sometimes it is more entertaining to see somebody else do it, but you're right, Joe.
Okay?
And that's what I will do. No, you're right.
I mean, it's not entertaining to watch you fiddle around.
That is, you're 100% right there. See, I don't usually get this kind of bullcrap from most of my students, Joe.
Well, then we're going to increase the ration for you.
That's perfectly acceptable. But,
as you know, we're here voluntarily.
and you are perfectly free to and enjoy reminding me of saying. In terms of logic, much more importantly than getting a definitive answer on any particular question, one finds a way of distinguishing truth from falsehood with the use of logic. Sometimes that distinction between truth and falsehood is relative, and sometimes it is absolute. The lawyer by training is seeking a way to make the logic of the law serve his client. Ideally, you thinkers are seeking to learn what is closest to the truth of a particular question. He or she of necessity must, as much as possible, shelve what he or she or I would like to be the solution. But as I stressed with an email recently, understanding the point of view of one's opposition and one's own is imperative. It's necessary both to effectively address your opposition and, if you're intending to convert your opposition is necessary to understand where they are coming from in order to help them adopt it. I want to introduce you to Dorothy Lipstadt. Dorothy Lipstadt is a teacher of Holocaust history at some university. And I'm going to draw back, having told you that she's a teacher of Holocaust history, I'm going to say that she is a joiner rather than a splitter. In academics, you have people who lump all apples in one basket and all oranges in another basket and all bananas in a third basket. And you will have splitters who will split out the type apple A and type apple B and type apple C and Sweet Alice type apple D in 4 different baskets, and equally pick out of the basket of oranges 3 different kinds of oranges, and in the basket of bananas 6 different kinds of bananas. You have joiners and you have splitters. The conversation I had with my friends in Colorado had to do with the emergence of the human species from Africa between 100,000 and 300,000 years ago. And the question arose as to how different have the various expressions of the human species changed since coming out of Africa, and can we and should we consider them to be still the same human species? To which I asked, are you a joiner or are you a splitter? Does a person's skin color change their species? Does a person's shape of their eyes change their species? And that specialty that puts entities in categories will say that that's one level of separation, and you need this level of separation to distinguish between non-humanoid anthropoids and human anthropoids. So, Dr. Lipstadt is a joiner. Joe, you're going to get on my back in a moment.
I'm trying to hope you success.
I appreciate your...
I don't know what your obsession is with playing with this thing.
Well, I have some interesting speakers. This speaker that I was trying to elicit is a Nobel Prize winner on the subject of superconductivity. And he was asked to speak at a program on global warming. And he presented a slide that said the American Physical Society had said that global warming is incontrovertible. Now you can discuss whether conductivity is controvertible or not, but the American Physical Society had declared that that global warming was incontrovertible.
You mean you can't discuss it, or it's...
That's what the American Physical Society was saying, that it was basically a settled issue.
Okay.
Okay? And he resigned from the American Physical Society with the assertion that global warming had achieved the status of a new religion. Because any question in science or in history that was no longer subject to debate and discussion qualified as a new religion. So he resigned. He said, this is no longer a question of science. You guys have made it a question of religion.
I come to you today to speak of liars, lawsuits, and laughter. The first time I heard about Holocaust denial, I laughed. Holocaust denial? The Holocaust, which has the dubious distinction of being the best documented genocide in the world. Who could believe it didn't happen? Think about it. For deniers to be right, who would have to be wrong? Well, first of all, the victims, the survivors, who have told us their harrowing stories. Who else would have to be wrong? The bystanders, the people who lived in the myriads of towns and villages and cities on the Eastern Front, who watched their neighbors be rounded up, men, women, children, young, old, and be marched to the outskirts of the town to be shot and left dead in ditches. Or the Poles, who lived in towns or villages around the death camps, who watched day after day as the trains went in, filled with people, and came out empty. But above all, who would have to be wrong? The perpetrators, the people who say, we did it, I did it. Now maybe they add a caveat. They say, I didn't have a choice, I was forced to do it. But nonetheless, they said, I did it. Think about it. In not one war crimes trial since the end of World War II has a perpetrator of any nationality ever said it didn't happen. Again, they may have said I was forced, but never that it didn't happen. Having thought that through, I decided denial was not going to be on my agenda. I had bigger things to worry about, to write about, to research, and I moved on. Fast forward a little over a decade, and two senior scholars of the Holocaust, two most prominent historians of the Holocaust, approached me and said, Deborah, let's have coffee. We have a research idea that we think is perfect for you. Intrigued and flattered that they came to me with an idea and thought me worthy of it, I asked, what is it? And they said, Holocaust denial. And for the second time, I laughed. Holocaust denial? The flat earth folks? The Elvis is alive people? I should study them? And these two guys said, yeah, we're intrigued. What are they about? What's their objective? How do they manage to get people to believe what they say? So thinking, if they thought it was worthwhile, I would take a momentary diversion. Maybe a year, maybe 2, 3, maybe even 4. In academic terms, that's momentary. We work very slowly. And I would look at them. So I did. I did my research, and I came up with a number of things, 2 of which I'd like to share with you today. 1, deniers are wolves in sheep's clothing. They are the same Nazis, neo-Nazis. You can decide whether you want to put a neo there or not. But when I looked at them, I didn't see any SS-like uniforms, swastika-like symbols on the wall, Sieg Heil salutes, none of that. What I found instead were people parading as respectable academics. What did they have? They had an institute for historical review. They had a journal, a slick journal, a journal of historical review. One filled with papers, footnote-laden papers. And they had a new name, not neo-Nazis, not anti-Semites, revisionists. They said, we are revisionists. We are out to do one thing, to revise mistakes in history. But all you had to do was go 1 inch below the surface. And what did you find there? The same adulation of Hitler, praise of the Third Reich, anti-Semitism, racism, prejudice. This is what intrigued me. It was anti-Semitism, racism, prejudice parading as rational discourse. The other thing I found, and we saw a slide earlier about facts and opinions. Many of us have been taught to think there are facts and there are opinions. After studying deniers, I think differently. There are facts, there are opinions, and there are lies. And what deniers want to do is take their lies, dress them up as opinions, maybe edgy opinions, maybe sort of out-of-the-box opinions, but then if they're opinions, they should be part of the conversation. And then they encroach on the facts. I published my work. The book was published, Denying the Holocaust, The Growing Assault on Truth and Memory. Came out in many different countries, including here in Penguin, UK, and I was done with those folks and ready to move on. Then came the letter from Penguin, UK. And for the third time, I laughed. Mistakenly. I opened the letter, and it informed me that David Irving was bringing a libel suit against me in the United Kingdom for calling him a Holocaust denier. David Irving suing me. Who was David Irving? David Irving was a writer of historical works, most of them about World War II, and virtually all of those works took the position that the Nazis were really not so bad, and the Allies were really not so good, and the Jews, whatever happened to them, they sort of deserved it. He knew the documents, he knew the facts, but he somehow twisted them to get this opinion. He hadn't always been a Holocaust denier, but in the late 80s, he embraced it with great vigor. The reason I laughed also was this was a man who not only was a Holocaust denier, but seemed quite proud of it. Here was a man, and I quote, who said, "I'm going to sink the battleship Auschwitz." Here was a man who pointed to the number tattooed on a survivor's arm and said, "How much money have you made from having that number tattooed on your arm?" Here was a man who said, "More people died in Senator Kennedy's car at Chappaquiddick than died in gas chambers at Auschwitz." It's an American reference, but you can look it up. This was not a man who seemed at all ashamed or reticent about being a Holocaust denier. Now, lots of my academic colleagues counseled me, Deborah, just ignore it. When I explained you can't just ignore a libel suit, they said, who's going to believe him anyway? But here was the problem. British law put the onus, put the burden of proof on me to prove the truth of what I said, in contrast to, as it would have been in the United States and in many other countries, on him to prove the falsehood. What did that mean? That meant if I didn't fight, he would win by default. And if he won by default, he could then legitimately say, my, David Irving, version of the Holocaust is a legitimate version. Deborah Lipstadt was found to have libeled me when she called me a Holocaust denier. Ipso facto, I, David Irving, am not a Holocaust denier. And what is that version? There was no plan to murder the Jews. There were no gas chambers. There were no mass shootings. Hitler had nothing to do with any suffering that went on. And the Jews have made this all up to get money from Germany and to get a state. And they've done it with the aid and abetance of the Allies. They've planted the documents and planted the evidence. I couldn't let that stand and ever face a survivor or a child of survivors. I couldn't let that stand and consider myself a responsible historian. So we fought, and for those of you who haven't seen Denial, spoiler alert, We won. The judge found David Irving to be a liar, a racist, an anti-Semite. His view of history was tendacious. He lied, he distorted, and most importantly, he did it deliberately. We showed a pattern in over 25 different major instances, not small things. Many of us in this audience write books or writing books. We always make mistakes. That's why we're glad to have second editions, correct the mistakes. But these always moved in the same direction. Blame the Jews, exonerate the Nazis. But how did we win? What we did is follow his footnotes back to his sources. And what did we find? Not in most cases and not in the preponderance of cases, but in every single instance where he made some reference to the Holocaust, that his supposed evidence was distorted, half-truth, date changed, sequence changed, someone put at a meeting who wasn't there. In other words, he didn't have the evidence. His evidence didn't prove it. We didn't prove what happened. We proved that what he said happened, and by extension, all deniers, because he either quotes them or they get their arguments from him, is not true. What they claim, they don't have the evidence to prove it. So why is my story more than just the story of a quirky, long, 6-year, difficult lawsuit, an American professor being dragged into a courtroom by a man that the court declared in its judgment was a neo-Nazi polemicist? What message does it have? I think in the context of the question of truth, it has a very significant message. Because today, as we well know, truth and facts are under assault. Social media, for all the gifts it has given us, has also allowed the difference between facts, established facts, and lies to be flattened.
The only thing that Ms. Lipstadt says that I'm in agreement with is that she's absolutely right. There is an assault on truth nowadays, and I hope we can counteract it. I want to tell you a little bit. Let's see if the next slide helps me on that. Your question?
I said, why not set up a discussion between her and Norman Finkelstein?
Oh, in terms of Dr. Finkelstein would almost certainly be in complete agreement with her on it.
Oh.
I want to tell you a little bit about this and tell you why that the only statement that Ms. Lipstadt made that I agree with is that truth is under assault. This is her victory lap, having successfully defended herself with the assistance of a full-time researcher working for 2 years, combing through David Irving's work, the support of a substantial number of Jewish support groups in Great Britain, and unlimited funds. They both agreed on having a judge rather than a jury, but Mr. Irving chose to act as his own lawyer. Now, what do you call a man, what do you call the lawyer of a man who has chosen to work as his own lawyer?
A fool, you know.
Yeah, he's got a fool for a client.
Yeah.
I haven't the biggest idea. I peripherally know Mr. Irving. He's a bit pugnacious. He's not at all anti-Semitic, though he's been attacked incredibly cruelly by a number of Jewish people. He's not one of those who's gotten his brains beaten out by some Jewish gangsters, but he's at risk of it. Dr. Lipstadt never gets around to saying why David Irving became what she's calling a Holocaust denier. In the late 1980s, an expert on executions, Fred Leuchter in the United States, was asked to do a forensic examination of the gas chamber, so-called gas chambers at Auschwitz, and I believe one other, but I'm not certain of that. And he did, and he said, there's no way, this is a guy who designed the gas chambers for several state institutions, and although he didn't have an advanced degree, he knew a great deal about the controlled execution of human beings. And he said, it's absurd to call these execution chambers. In addition, he, and this is reproduced by two other people subsequently, took scrapings of the walls of several chambers. Chambers that supposedly were gas chambers, and chambers that were documented as chambers for the use of delousing clothing. Zyklon B gas, which releases hydrogen cyanide gas, is used for the delousing of clothing at virtually all of the concentration camps in Germany and in the eastern countries. The chambers that were admitted to be delousing chambers had all turned blue, and they gave ample evidence of exposure to hydrogen cyanide gas. If you're interested in the chemistry, when hydrogen cyanide comes in contact with iron-containing salts, the iron-containing salts are converted to ferric ferrocyanide. It's what's called Prussian blue. So where there were chambers that were exposed to hydrogen cyanide through delousing clothing, those chambers showed the blue discoloration. Those chambers that were supposedly execution chambers, no blue. Two subsequent examiners have confirmed those results. I have here two films that you may be interested. We're not going to show them, Joe, to your great relief. One is called 1/3 of the Holocaust. You can find it on YouTube. And the other is called David Cole at Auschwitz. In both of those film presentations, examiners who are not trying to prove any point, they're trying to find what is the forensic evidence for the official story. In looking at the details of the of the official story, it's virtually impossible to find any corroborating physical evidence. Now, to partially get back to Ms. Lipstadt, the official story of the Holocaust involves three key elements. 6 million, which if you look at Jewish literature, starts long before World War II. It actually goes back to World War I, and I think there's one episode before it. It seems to have some mythic significance. The number of victims, the official plan, the German plan for extermination of Jewish people, and third, the use of gas chambers as a major element in the accomplishment of this plan. Ms. Lipstadt refers to mass murders of Jews, and it's the only two named mass murders that I know of are the murders at Katyn Forest and Baba Yar. The murders at Katyn Forest accused Russians of being responsible. No, I've got to get that turned around. Accused Germans of being responsible for killing Polish officers, and it turns out that it was not the German. And I apologize. It's been a while since I've reviewed this. One group was accused of doing it, and I'm virtually certain that the Germans were accused of killing the Polish officers, and it turns out that the Soviets actually did kill the Polish officers. The other mass murder is reported to have taken place at Baba Yar, which is a small village, actually it's a ravine, outside of Kiev, Ukraine. And we have aerial photography throughout the war of that area, and although certain people have declared that hundreds, if not thousands, of Jews were massacred by Germans at that location when the Germans came through, the aerial photography suggests that the ground hasn't been disturbed since before World War II. There's zero forensic evidence of anybody being buried there, much less hundreds of Jewish bodies. Does that mean that there weren't massacres? No. It means that that particular massacre does not support the Jewish myth. No.
Okay, so the author that you're talking about, this other fellow,
David Irving?
Irving, how many Jews does he say were killed in World War II? Or does he?
He doesn't. The best estimates that I know of now are between about 130,000 and perhaps up to 1 million. Tom?
I think he's changed his position. His latest position was that there were some Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing squads, those were operating. But he said that the majority of the people who died in the concentration camps died from starvation and typhus.
Starvation and typhus. And you are raising an interesting question, and I don't know what Irving's most recent position on that is. I don't doubt the existence of sadistic officers. I don't doubt the existence of sadistic groups, because it is part and parcel of the Nazi ideology that Jews and Slavs both were Untermenschen. So that the fact that Hitler, it cannot be demonstrated that Hitler planned for the extermination of the Jewish people. It's clear that he did plan on the ethnic cleansing of Europe of Jews. That's not disputed. And I want to be perfectly clear that I'm not, as Ms. Lipstadt said, saying that the Germans weren't so bad. In fact, one of the interesting things is that in a parade, a military parade that Hitler engineered in 1937, demonstrates that the people of Berlin were not at all enthusiastic about the militarization of Germany in 1937. And Hitler turned to one of his aides and said, "How can you go to war with a people like this, who were totally unenthusiastic?" I'm not talking about inside the Nazi Party, I'm talking about the German people generally. One of the major problems with Ms. Lipstadt is she is thinking of good guys and bad guys. If you look at the effective murder of hundreds of thousands, if not 1 million German prisoners of war by Eisenhower, if you look at the saturation bombing of German towns and the firebombing of Hamburg and Dresden, it's absolutely clear that Winston Churchill was a war criminal. If you look at the use of nuclear weapons in Japan, and not just the nuclear weapons, the United States made a practice of firebombing literally hundreds of cities in Japan. And it didn't really matter to the Japanese whether it was one aircraft and one bomb, or hundreds of aircraft and hundreds of bombs. They had tens, if not hundreds, of cities that were spent up in flame with the intention of burning civilians. So when Ms. Lipstadt talks about good guys and bad guys, she's living in some different world.
I missed when she said why she wrote who came to her to ask her to write it, who probably gave her the money. Who did she say it was?
She didn't say it.
Okay.
And I will speculate on the basis of understanding a little bit about Miss Lipstadt. A couple people in Jewish historiography came to Miss Lipstadt because, like David Irving, they assessed her as being sufficiently combative that she would do a good job on as an attack dog. That's my speculation. Each academic has a certain kind of reputation, and he or she would like to preserve that reputation if they are able to. Ward Churchill did not intend to get a reputation as a radical at the University of Colorado. He kind of got that reputation by opening his mouth once too often. Miss Lipstadt was willing to work as an attack dog because the people who want to examine Holocaust history are at least potentially dangerous.
Yeah.
Now, I mentioned the three elements of the mythic Holocaust, and I've mentioned those elements that are not deniable. There's no question that Nazi ideology declared the Aryan people superior to Slavs and Jews. Indeed, I want to point out that the similarity between Zionist ideology and Nazi ideology is incredible.
It's not even inseparable. It's the same ideology.
It's the same ideology. You have to change certain nouns from Aryan to Jewish. You have to change certain nouns as Europe to Palestine.
But the philosophy is
The
the
philosophy is identical. You're quite correct.
same. Yeah.
I'm going to draft you to give one of these lectures, Joe.
Well, why don't you do a study of why the peace cannot be created in Palestine? Because you could, if you sorted out the fact that Netanyahu and his buddies control the philosophy of Israel, you can show why the peace will not come there.
The Zionists want the peace of death. They want the land
Yes.
without the Arabs.
Yes.
That is their understanding of peace.
Yeah.
As, quite honestly, the Nazis wanted Western Europe, or wanted Europe for the Aryans, and they didn't want any Jews there. They were prepared to send them to
United States.
the United States. They were more than happy to send them to Palestine. They were going to send them to Madagascar. So the official plan was simply to get them out of Europe. And they were working on that.
And then there's another good question that should be looked at, and that is, the Nazis were using as many slaves, if you want, to work in industry. They wanted as much labor as they could gather to work in industry.
Which is exactly why they used their incarcerated prisoners,
Yeah, so
political prisoners as well as criminal prisoners,
So
as
why-
slave labor.
So why would they create death camps unless these people in the death camps were just impossible to deal with? And
Which
so
they were not.
they were easier to kill than they were to extract the labor from. So why isn't the question laid out there about slave labor versus killing these people?
You ask the question, I bet you can answer it.
No, I can't.
I can.
Okay.
Because there are people who gain both financially and politically from the perpetuation of the myth.
Yes.
If you,
Oh, yeah, sure.
if the American people, if the Western people and the German people have bought it lock, stock, and barrel, if you can convince the German people that their fathers and grandfathers were guilty of mass murder, you can extract nuclear submarines from them, you can extract all kinds of reparation. Now, the vast majority of the Jews believe it because they get a financial benefit of it? No.
Can I add you were asking a question why there isn't any peace in the Palestine-Israel. There is a plan that most people are not familiar with. It's called the Greater Israel Plan, sometimes known as the Oded Yanan Plan. And that calls for the expansion of Israel and the control of the entire Middle East for groups like the Rothschilds. So the people in Israel really aren't in control. They're fronts for the Rothschild family.
As with Western Europe and the United States, there is a substantial difference between the people who are in control and the masses of people. Now, in terms of Israel, the people who are in control are the radically religious Zionists and the totally secular Zionists, who are completely in concert in terms of the extent of the land of Israel, the supremacy of the Jewish people in the land of Israel, and ultimately the supremacy of the Jewish people over the world. That's an ideology very parallel to the Nazi ideology. Not saying that either one was carried out to its fullest extent in this historical period. Now, with that as background, the Yanon plan actually goes back to the testimony that was given by several people when the question of the land being given to the Jews was being debated at the United Nations. And several representatives of the Jewish people said, ideally and eventually, the land of Israel will go from the brook of Egypt, that is presumed to be the Nile, to the Euphrates. Israel is the only country, to my knowledge, that has not officially declared what its borders are.
Well, I would like to draw a distinction between what they say. The Greater Israel Plan is a very specific plan, but if you look at what the American military is doing on behalf of the Zionists, you see that the entire Middle East is being restructured. They're forcing out most of the inhabitants because they're fleeing from the bombings and the terrorism. That is also part of the plan. So that entire Middle Eastern region is a geostrategic area which the Rothschilds and other people have been working on since before World War I, well before World War I.
I'm unwilling to go as far as you have just gone, Tom, because I don't have enough data. That the United States is serving the interest of Israel in the Middle East is unquestionable. That the neoconservatives have control of American Middle East policy is beyond question. That the Greater Israel Plan is part of the Zionist plan is also, in my opinion, beyond question. Whether that is representative of Rothschild interests or not, I have not yet seen enough data.
Well, there's a couple of pieces of the puzzle that for me, I find to be very important. If you look at the Schofield Bible that was created and also what the goals of Vatican II were, and if you look at those two movements, you can see that the Zionist interests were interested in converting not only Catholics but the vast majority of Protestants into being Zionists from a previous position of being anti-Zionist.
Well, non-Zionist, because prior to Schofield there was no Zionist movement.
Well, historically, if you look at Martin Luther, he wrote a book that was
Zionism in any recognizable political form didn't come into existence until the fourth quarter of the 19th century, 1875.
well, let me put it differently, anti-Semitic. Martin Luther wrote a book that was, he had read the Talmud and he saw what was in there, and he wrote a book.
That's true, but anti-Semitism is absolutely essential for Zionism. But Zionism did not create anti-Semitism, and anti-Semitism did not create Zionism. They're two substantially different.
Yeah, I think it's also important to draw a distinction that Zionists are, in reality, a controlled opposition. They're a controlled group. They don't have their own autonomy. Same thing with the Germans during World War II. They didn't have control of what was happening. They were
Neither
forced
do I
to-
in this class at the moment.
I'm sorry?
Neither do I in this class at the moment.
Well,
No.
maybe.
It is absolutely the case that Zionists need anti-Semitism because you are not going to get Jews to emigrate to Palestine, to Israel, unless they feel endangered in France, Germany, the United States, etc. So anti-Semitism is absolutely essential for Zionism to prosper. But anti-Semitism existed for a variety of reasons before Zionism came into existence, and in some residual form probably after Zionism disappears from history.
Well, controlling the argument, if you're going to create an argument, you've got to have control over the argument.
This is also
The
true.
point you're making is exactly that. You've got to have the forward position and then the opposition.
You need an opponent, and the more dangerous your opponent looks, the more readily you will gather followers to yours, because they will be fleeing the opposition. That's why Zionists
Yeah.
need,
Yeah,
and in fact, in one sense, Zionism arose, the cultural necessity for some answer arose because of the perception of anti-Semitism in Europe in the 19th century, along with the rise of nationalism in Europe. Frenchmen started thinking of themselves as Frenchmen. Germans, instead of looking at 15 or so different duchies, started thinking of themselves as Germans. Italians started working toward the unification of Italy. You had the rise of nationalism throughout Western Europe, and the Jews said, hey, that's not a bad idea. I suggest anyone who's interested, go read The Invention of the Jewish People. That's very well done. I'm going to pass this over because I've had so much help that I'm not going to even have to go there. The historians that dare examine the statements encounter two distinguishable types of emotional response. One is perfectly understandable. That is, a Jew who lost a father or mother or grandfather or grandmother in what they call the Holocaust can readily interpret the Holocaust denier as somehow denigrating the memory of their father or grandfather or mother or grandmother. And this is where I would suspect that Norm Finkelstein, on the question of the reality of the Holocaust, would be in complete agreement with Ms. Lipstadt. There is tremendous emotional and cultural and psychological pressure on a contemporary Jew to adhere to the official story, because you are basically walking away from your tribe if you challenge the tribal myth. The other reason, from within the Jewish perspective, to defend the Holocaust story is to defend the multiple forms of reparations that are being paid in all forms to Jewish claims on Germany and the Allies for their failure to protect. These two forms of opposition are almost exclusively Jewish, but there is a third form. It's a form that I experience within my own family, and you will experience, and that is a form, and actually it was evident in Demida last week. those who have been taught the Jewish myth have been taught not only that it is historically accurate, but as Ms. Lipstadt implied, it is morally reprehensible to challenge that myth. Ms. Lipstadt was astonished that David Irving was proud. I don't think he was proud, he was simply assertive. But the politically acceptable, the Maginot Line, the corral inside which decent people live, is occupied by people who accept the mythic Holocaust. The story that has been pushed on Western Europe and the United States is a story that has moral implications for the people, for the person or people who challenge it. Now, is that sensible? Well, if I'm denigrating somebody's father, then it's sensible. If it's challenging reparations, maybe we should take a look at the historical validity for the reparations. But if it's emotional rather than based on historical reality, it is simply emotional. And the vast majority of Gentiles have been taught that questioning the Holocaust is a little worse than murder and about comparable with pedophilia. That's not rational. That's just an attitude that has been taught. And it is easy to teach attitude. Now, I want to address the question of the forensic evidence for the Holocaust myth. And this is part a repetition of part of a session we had last year. But it's worth going over because we have a question of historical orthodoxy versus re-evaluation. David Cole is a young Jew who had the audacity to raise the question. And he had to go into hiding. After these YouTube videos appeared publicly, he had to go into hiding because the enforcers of the Holocaust were literally out after his hide, and I don't mean that metaphorically. Joel Hayward, who is now an older Jew but was a young Jew when he wrote his master's thesis in New Zealand, innocently came to the conclusion that the mythic Holocaust didn't happen. Now, how his research advisor allowed him to write that from a political point of view is kind of mysterious to me, and I haven't investigated that. But poor Joel Hayward had his master's thesis degree withdrawn from him. He was drummed out of New Zealand. He was forced under severe political pressure to renounce his own findings in his master's thesis. He's now teaching military history at some academy. He's had to basically turn his back on the research that he did and his graduate work, precisely because it was too politically dangerous. The consequences of World War II were known to Americans before World War II was over. The primary aim of official propaganda, whether we're talking about the Holocaust, whether we're talking about 9/11, whether we're talking about Russiagate and Donald Trump, is not so much to get people to believe the propaganda. It is to draw a line between socially acceptable people and socially strange people. socially acceptable people and deniers, or conspiracy theorists, or Elvis is alive people. The Elvis is alive people are like Holocaust deniers, are like conspiracy theorists. They're outside the pale of acceptable human behavior. And if you can get your culture to accept that, the barriers for critical examination of any reality, whether we're talking about the new religion of global warming or the Middle Age religion of Holocaust denial, or the new religion of 9/11 being done by Arab terrorists, if you can get a substantial percentage of people to say that's socially unacceptable, you have made it very difficult for anyone with a sense of curiosity to ask the innocent question, Daddy, why do we say that? If you can get that Maginot line drawn the way you want it drawn, you can extract all kinds of benefits from it. Which side of that wall do you want to be on? In countless ways, each of us is asked to ask that question and to have an answer. Conform and there is a place for you inside polite society. Refuse and good luck out there. The taboo that is unique is the ultimate persecution of the Jews. The predecessor to the Holocaust myth goes back to the book of Esther and the book of Daniel, where Jews were the ultimate persecuted people and delivered by God. First and Second Maccabees in the pseudepigrapha, same story. The Khmelnytsky, I always have problems with it, massacres of the 18th century confirm that Jews are the persecuted people. They are the ultimate victims. The fact that they were landlords for Polish lords and princes, and the fact that when the, I almost had the word, when the Polish serfs rose up and tossed off their princes, they also hated and killed their Jewish landlords. That is chalked up as Jewish persecution, not as a political persecution. The Tsarist pogroms were evidence further that the Jews are always the victims. A very nice Jewish scholar was delivering a lecture, and it's available on YouTube, on a Tsarist pogrom that took place in 1907. And he was delivering his lecture to his Jewish audience, and he had to apologize to them. He had to apologize to them because they wanted to believe that the Tsar was responsible for the pogrom in 1907. And he said, I'm sorry to tell you, but the Tsar himself wasn't responsible for it. It was certain people lower in the, on the pecking order that were responsible for that particular pogrom. And yet you could tell he was apologizing to his audience for deconstructing the evil Tsar. If you've got an evil party and a good party that's always the victim, you have a great story. You have a story that would be admired by Hans Christian Andersen. Douglas Reed and Harold Wilton were very good journalists, but they became non-persons when they had the audacity to challenge the story that the Jews were the perpetual victims. Both Douglas Reed and Harold Wilton revealed that in certain elements of history, they were not the victims, they were the perpetrators of evil. Zionist propaganda is a functioning reality that Jews are the perpetual victims and they expect to be persecuted. Atzmon refers to pre-traumatic stress disorder. Now, they were already set up by their tribal mythology to think of themselves as the ultimate victims. Henry Morgenthau Jr. was Secretary of the Treasury, but he knew absolutely nothing about economics, which is why Harry Dexter White negotiated with Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, at Bretton Woods. But Morgenthau was very concerned. He was Jewish. He was very concerned about the welfare of the Jews in Europe, and he kept nagging Franklin Roosevelt to do something about the terrible conditions under which the Jews were living. And they were suffering persecution, no doubt about it. Sometimes for rational reasons, and other times because they were part of the wrong cultural class. But nevertheless, Roosevelt, in desperation, assigned Morgenthau to be part of the War Refugee Board, which was in charge of clearing information that was coming from Europe. The Verba-Wechsler report came out of Auschwitz. Kind of a terrifying story with absurd implications. But in terms of what people were hearing in the United States, propaganda is reported to be entirely in the hands, in Jewish hands, and the public is totally ignorant except for what gets through those Jewish hands. Their propaganda is so effective that people have no real knowledge of the true state of affairs in Europe. That was observed in 1939. That was observed subsequently by Douglas Reed, and I would say by 1945, what Americans knew about the circumstances in Europe and the circumstances of the Jews in Europe was totally in the hands of the media. If you go to an interesting documentary, available in Documentary Heaven, on the Nuremberg Tribunal, quite well done, and I would love to use it as the background for a discussion sometime, because all of the people that I've examined so far that are discussing how well done the Nuremberg Tribunal was are Jewish participants in the Nuremberg Tribunal. And for the purposes of the Jewish tribe, the Nuremberg Tribunal was absolutely marvelous. As an example of the political reasons, very recently, Polish officials have declared it illegal to distribute any information about the Polish persecution of Jews. But there's enough political distortion of information, whether we're talking about Polish, Jewish, German, Soviet, or American, there's enough political distortion of information to make research on the subject very difficult. Western Jews thought they had a lot of information, and frankly what they had was a lot of fear. The Verba-Wechsler report came out of Auschwitz. It was two Jews who had reportedly escaped from Auschwitz and reported what they had seen and heard to two Jewish groups in Austria, which subsequently translated it from Yiddish into English, subsequently into English. The narrative is frightening, but the details are absurd. Henry Morgenthau Jr. was in charge of that information being released to the press, and the press, when they initially were exposed to it, thought, it looks a whole lot more like propaganda than it looks like information. But Morgenthau approved it as being legitimate when his other two members of the War Refugee Board were out of town. Once the Verber-Wetzler report was released, it basically became the foundation for the official history as far as news about the Jews in Europe was concerned. I summarize it by saying in the 17th century, everybody knew that there were witches and that they were real. And in the 20th century, everyone knew that the Nazis had tried to exterminate the Jews. A debate at the end of the war developed as to how the Nazi leadership should be trained, should be dealt with. The question came up, should they be put on trial or should they be summarily executed? The Jews and the American public were both seeking vengeance. As a matter of fact, everyone was seeking vengeance on the Germans, on the Nazis. Whether the Soviets, and the Soviets were delighted to take, I think millions, but at least hundreds of thousands of German prisoners to work in the gulags. The Jews were delighted to put the Germans on trial. Let's go. They wound up with show trials, and interestingly enough, the charge of extermination of European Jews came as a surprise to the Germans under accusation. If you look at the Nuremberg Tribunal critically, not with the view that it's a heroic first, but with the view of asking, is it a valid legal proceedings? You have to say it's a kangaroo court. First of all, in terms of deciding to put the Nazis on trial, they ruled out the defense that you were doing it too. If I hit Russ in the nose, after Russ has hit me in the nose, I have broken the law of hitting him in the nose. And the fact that Russ hit me in the nose first is not a defense. So if the Germans say, Germans are accused of firebombing London, and the Germans say, but you were firebombing our cities first, that's a disallowable defense. First number. So how they arranged to call this a legal tribunal is kind of a distortion. But it's only a distortion when you look at it closely. If you succeed in selling it as the first and foremost proceedings to condemn the crimes against humanity, it's a great achievement. But guess what? The United States has been violating the dictates of the Nuremberg Tribunal in country after country after country in the last 70 years. We don't seem to notice it. It is still a hallowed tribunal until you look at the implications for what's happening today. As examples of how it is a kangaroo court, Rudolf Hess, his confession was read out in court. It was obtained after 48 hours of interrogation, and that interrogation reached the point where the medical officer who was supervising the interrogators had to stop them unless they wanted to bring back a corpse. Threats to deliver family members to the court were a significant member of inducing confessions in lesser criminals. Threats and bribes for favorable treatment were exchanged for favorable testimony. The question comes up sometimes, and it comes up with what Ms. Lipstadt had to say. In many cases, the Germans, knowing that it was futile to say we didn't do something that you accused us of doing, included absurd details so that subsequent generations would know that something was incredibly fishy. I am told that the same thing comes up in the trial of the person in Jerusalem. Help me out, Joel.
Eichmann?
Yes, Eichmann. The Eichmann trial, that Eichmann also included some absurd details that should have suggested to the person reading critically that he was giving clues. One of the clues that was given by the person who was, quote, giving a confession was that one of the ways that the Jews were being murdered was asphyxiation with carbon monoxide gas that was produced by a diesel engine. A diesel engine that was brought from a captured submarine and brought to where it could be placed to asphyxiate the Jews. The fact of the matter is that no Russian submarines were captured by the Germans. A diesel engine from a submarine is a mammoth thing. The place where this was supposed to have taken place was 300 miles inland. And besides that, a diesel engine produces remarkably little carbon monoxide. The fact of the matter is that that's an absurd detail that the person who was confessing was leaving a clue that the confession was bogus. His life was going to be forfeit. He wanted to leave some evidence behind that what he was saying was nonsense. And if all you've got to do is leave some evidence behind, I don't know of a better way of leaving the evidence behind. There were all kinds of Jews in Robert Jackson's collection of people working on the Nuremberg Tribunal. I'm not going to read these off to you. One of them went on to become a commander in the Haganah after the Nuremberg tribunals. Several of them were very influential. One Jewish official was in charge of picking virtually all of the judges serving on the tribunal. Documentary evidence was based on special interpretations of certain documents, and some of those documents were in the possession of Jewish investigators for months on end before they were presented to the court. Basically, you're talking about a very fancy arrangement of what we used to believe happened in the South when a black man was was on trial for raping a white woman. No amount of physical evidence was going to get in the way of the conviction. Moreover, at Nuremberg, the only real evidence was testimonial evidence, which everyone who knows a little psychology to know is the least reliable. The lampshade that was supposedly made out of human skin, when it was subsequently examined, was made out of goat skin. The shrunken human head that was presumably made from one of the victims disappeared before it could be forensically examined. There are still people at the memorial in Israel that think the shoes that were collected from victims who were going to the gas chambers. We now know that German civilians from the surrounding area were bringing their shoes to be repaired at some of the camps. Most importantly, this book is very useful. I brought it to loan to Demita, but she's not here. The only way you can attack the Holocaust myth is detail by detail by detail. And as I've used the analogy in the past, it's kind of like going through a barn full of excrement, because with all that excrement, there might be a pony there. So far, nobody has found the real pony. Can you prove that there's not a pony there? No. We can just say that the myth when you look at the forensic evidence, it isn't there. But what is key in terms of let me go back a second. I wanted to point out that because there was such enthusiasm for the Holocaust myth, the Americans on the Western Front attempted to fake a gas chamber in one of the slave labor camps that they captured on the Western Front. But they weren't able to reproduce it good enough. And for a host of technical reasons, the Auschwitz part of the story cannot be true. Because of aerial photography, because of what David Cole has found in terms of the physical examination, because of the Polish corruption of what remains of Auschwitz, you don't have any reliable forensic evidence left. At least you don't have any reliable forensic evidence that demonstrates the myth. You have a lot of forensic evidence. It just doesn't happen to corroborate the myth. Incidentally, when Auschwitz authorities reduced the number of official victims at Auschwitz from 4 million to 1.1 million, the mythic 6 million didn't change. Raoul Hilberg simply added new victims to other sites of murder. As I say, revisionist historians simply have to work through the data very closely, because the only way you refute it is to work through it. Now, Ms. Lipstadt said that in every single case, I want to point out that a researcher looked at Hilberg's evidence for 2 years, and when she says that Hilberg distorted the evidence to his benefit in every single case, another way of saying that is Hilberg, or is that Lipstadt and her lawyers succeeded in convincing the judge that their interpretation of his footnotes was the correct interpretation, and therefore David Irving had distorted the data. And Lipstadt had a whole lot more juridical support than David Irving had. Let's see. Oh, I wanted to mention that the first appearance of gas chambers is in British propaganda, and Anne Frank heard it from a British broadcast, and that's the way it got included in her diaries. When I was a young chemist, I asked, could the Germans be that stupid? Because I know enough about hydrogen cyanide. I've used it to synthesize certain chemicals. And the Germans were expert at the creation of carbon monoxide because they had been using wood gas types of engines in Germany for the entire 1930s. You create wood gas that is burnable in an internal combustion engine by burning wood with a limited amount of oxygen. You collect the vapors above it, which is comparable to collecting the vapors above a charcoal pit, and that is burnable because it has a lot of carbon monoxide in it. They were experts at the creation of carbon monoxide, and yet they used, by report, Zyklon B. Those who have been pursuing the truth, like Germar Rudolph, have not been proven to be wrong, but they have lost their careers, they've lost their families, and some of them have had the crap beat out of them. Anyway, you've been patient and you've heard me out, and I'll entertain questions if I can answer them. Tom?
Can you compare the Holocaust with the Holodomor?
No, I know something about the Holodomor. I hope, John, I appreciate your coming. I
I
have
gotta go
no
back to Cedar
to
Rapids, and I still got a couple things I gotta do.
get them done.
See you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll be in touch. I'll send you an email message so that we have both. The Holodomor, you're talking about the deaths of millions of Ukrainians in the 1930s. As best I can tell at this point in time, Stalin didn't care whether the Ukrainians died or not, as long as the program was successful. Hitler was not particularly concerned if Jews died in transit, but his goal was to get them out of there. I think the matter is much more one of intent, but I have not compared them detail to detail now.
Yeah, I think Solzhenitsyn has attempted to call attention to the reality that the majority of Bolsheviks were Jews, and
That is true, although the majority of Russian Jews were not Bolshevik. In fact, Russian Jews were divided into two different camps. They were divided into those who would join the Bund and wanted more or less to assimilate, not to stop being Jewish, but to become Russian, and those who were opposed to becoming Russian and either retain their religious Jewish identity or become stateless communists. So you had, as best I can tell, you had three distinct social categories of Jews. Those who were intending and working at assimilation into Russian culture, those who were intending to create a common culture through membership in the Bund, and those who were intending to destroy state identity by becoming communist. And those are three distinctly different visions of citizenship in a state.
well, I was referencing that specifically in terms of who actually created the Holodomor.
I
Was it
don't
essentially-
have enough information to comment intelligently on that.
Was it essentially a Jewish created?
Was it essentially Jewish or was it essentially communist? Or are you saying that there were so few non-Jews in the Bolshevik Party that they don't count? I don't think that would be accurate.
Well, in terms of the Holocaust, there's a tremendous, if the Jews had been the ones who orchestrated the Holodomor, there would be a tremendous benefit for creating a mythological Holocaust in order to promote so that the Holodomor would be ignored, say, for instance.
Without seeing more evidence, I think you're stretching. And I suppose the most reasonable thing I can say there is that I would have to see the connection. It is true that most of the early Bolsheviks were Jews. Stalin was in the process of de-Judaizing the Bolsheviks in the 1930s. The Holodomor took place early in the 1930s, early and mid in the 1930s. I don't doubt that the Jewish Bolsheviks had a different understanding of being Russian than the non-Jewish Bolsheviks. The non-Jewish Bolsheviks, I would expect, had a greater sense of identity with the Russians than the Jewish Bolsheviks. Whether that gave them the inclination to be careless with Russian lives, I don't know.
Well, there's also indications that not only did Jews run the so-called Nazi death camps, the Sonderkommandos, but they also ran the gulags in Soviet Russia.
That they ran the gulags, at least to some extent ran the gulags, would not be surprising to me.